Welcome to the amazing return to Hamilton Place of the Historical Group lectures. We're now the Heritage Group, but that's only a pedantic detail. Great to see people making the effort to come back into town. It's not over, but it's certainly declining, so good to be here. I have to run through a few bits and pieces. Housekeeping, there will not be a fire alarm test in the building today, so if it sounds, please exit the building. The assembly point is the paved and railed area on Hamilton Place where it intersects with Piccadilly beyond the Intercontinental, and there will be staff to guide you should that unlikely event happen. If you have any mobility or access issues, then the safe exit would be via the ramp through these doors. There's also a fire exit out the back there, which goes straight out onto the street. Please don't leave any bags unattended. Please switch mobile phones to silent, if you would. And we are recording the event, so questions will be recorded at the end. There will be opportunity for questions, and that will then be put online. We're not streaming live tonight, but it will be put online later. I'd like to introduce Paul Stoddart, our speaker tonight, who joined the Royal Air Force in 1983 and then served with the VC-10 and Hawk, and then officer training at RAF Cranwell, left the RAF in 91, working at Farnborough on the Tornado Successor programme and then Boscombe down for Harrier programmes. He has an MA degree in Defence Studies at King's College London, a Fellow of the Society, and is well placed to talk to us tonight on 1941. So it's not the Battle of Britain for a change. So 1941, leaning into France for the RAF Fighter Command, ambitions and results. Just for your, I haven't introduced myself, and I should. I'm Peter Davison. I've been on the Heritage Group for about 18 years, and I'm currently a deputy chair. So stepping in today to chair this evening. I hope you all enjoy it. Paul.
Right, good evening. I'll avoid any potentially politically loaded categorisation of the audience. I'll just say good evening, colleagues, or something to that effect. The title of the presentation, I've called it the second act in terms of what did Fighter Command actually do after the Battle of Britain. As Peter said, that particular campaign gets a lot of attention. In fact, the Battle of Britain, so far as the forces of Fighter Command were concerned, represented what I called a brilliant performance in the first act. And then, essentially, Fighter Command doesn't exactly disappear from history, but certainly the spotlight moves, metaphorically at least, to the nighttime strategic offensive by Bomber Command, ranging from about 1941 through to the end of the Second World War. What was Fighter Command doing in that period after the battle, and what was it achieving? Now, to give some notion, and this is an entirely unscientific survey, but it offers some indication of the level of interest. Go into the library at the RF Club, and I think the same would be the case if you would go to a good bookshop such as Waterstones down Piccadilly and look at the military history section. 2 shelves full of books on the Battle of Britain specifically in the RF Club library, and that covers a period of 3 months, I think, in the summer, early autumn of 1940. Then have 5 whole shelves covering the Bomber Command strategic offensive, Fighter Command after the Battle of Britain, and I will only look at 1941 this evening, creeping into 1942 very slightly, but there is practically nothing in the historical record, at least not in what you might call its conventional public domain sense, looking at what that particular command did following its amazing first act performance. And yet a great deal of effort was actually expended. As you can see, in terms of measuring effort in terms of the number of sorties flown, clearly you had a high number of sorties flown in 1940, the majority of that being during the highly intensive period of the 3 months or so of the battle. And then 1941, the Fighter Command effort actually exceeded that. In fact, that total was not to be exceeded for the rest of the war, with a gradual decline 42, 43, 44. I think the very low total in 1945 is probably explained by many of the resources being moved to organisations such as the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and they were operating on the continent, so they were no longer, strictly speaking, part of Fighter Command. But it is notable just how intensive the operations were during 1941 itself. context of Fighter Command in 1941. The nighttime blitz by the Luftwaffe against various cities, and particularly aiming at important industrial facilities in Britain, followed the battle, with various controversies arising as to how well Fighter Command was prepared in actually preventing that, or at least mitigating it. Britain and its Commonwealth was facing Germany and Italy. It was not Britain alone, as is sometimes portrayed in the popular press. The Commonwealth offered quite extensive resources, and that's a story for another day. America was neutral at the time, at least prior to the 7th of December 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, and was trading quite freely with Britain in terms of armaments, fuel, food, and so forth, providing we coughed up. The Soviet Union was neutral, well, neutral in the sense having invaded the eastern half of Poland after the German invasion of the western half. So whether that counts as neutrality, I'll leave that for you to judge, and you can put that in the current context as well. But the Soviet Union was also trading with Germany in the sense of food and particularly energy. No change there. And Britain was in direct confrontation by land, air and sea with Italy in North Africa and East Africa being a campaign that doesn't really get the attention it perhaps merits. In the Mediterranean itself, with both sea power and carrier air power, and particularly the defence of the island of Malta. And over in the Far East there was the ominous potential of a threat from Japan. So that was the context in which 1941 really dawned for the UK. Quick aside, looking at the main players. Charles Portal, known as Peter to his family and friends, and I think he was generally known as Sir to everybody else, took over as Chief of the Air Staff October 1940 and held that post until after the end of the Second World War. So clearly he had this ongoing, continuing influence and oversight of all the commands of the Royal Air Force, Bomber Command, Fighter Command, Coastal Command, and so forth. Dowding, the Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief of Fighter Command during the battle itself, he was shuffled off with what some people call unseemly haste after the battle. He was not actually mentioned in the official account. Hermann Göring was mentioned by name, but Dowding was not. He was replaced by William Sholto Douglas, who then held that particular post for 1940 for 2 years, covering the period I'm looking at this evening, 1941, in its entirety. 11 Group, which essentially covered the southeastern part of England and bore the brunt of the battle itself, and then became central to the Fighter Command offensive into France in 1941. That had been commanded by Keith Park. Rather like Dowding, he was moved aside with somewhat unseemly haste after the battle, and he was replaced by the previous AOC of 12 Group, Trafford Lee Mallory, who took over, and rather like Sholto Douglas, served in that area for 2 years and therefore was responsible for the 1941 campaign, which predominantly was fought by the forces of 11 Group. Further context or circumstances, you might call it, there was the Battle of the Atlantic with the Kriegsmarine service, and particularly U-boat units, trying to sever the convoy links between the Americas and the Commonwealth to Britain itself. There was the start of the bomber offensive, which had shifted to nighttime operations following the very, very heavy losses during daytime. Confrontation with the Italian forces in North Africa and the Mediterranean, Malta under intensive air attack at times, and rather under-resourced in terms of the means to defend itself. And as 1941 grew on, there was the shift of German resources to the east in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And this actually left only 2 Fightergruppen in France and the Low Countries. So the opposition that the UK was facing in terms of German air power in northern France and their ability to project air power over England, or for that matter the whole of the UK, was considerably less than it had been during the battle in the summer of 1940. Now, there are various expectations. It's very easy when you're researching subjects like this to, of course, fall victim to the benefits of hindsight. We all know now far more than was known by the people involved at the time. But even so, some of their decisions, I think, can be reasonably criticised, even in the light of the knowledge they had available to them then. There was the expectation that the Luftwaffe might resume its mass daylight raids at the Battle of Britain over the UK during 1941, and there was a particular fear of what was termed a knockout blow, that there would somehow be this aerial silver bullet that would incapacitate the nation. Continued engagement with the Italians in the Med, North Africa, East Africa. No direct land engagement with the German forces had then been encountered, apart from maybe the odd commando raid. And the build-up of the bomber offensive, which was considered at the time, certainly by the proponents of air power, and within Bomber Command especially, and some elements of the Air Ministry, to be the near infallible or inevitable way of actually defeating Nazi Germany by air power alone. The outcomes were rather different. No plan survives contact with the enemy. There were no mass daylight raids by the Luftwaffe against the UK during 1941. There was considerable success against Italian forces in both East Africa and North Africa, and the pressure on Malta was resisted successfully, albeit at some high cost. Then the German forces entered the Balkans, and then encountering British and Commonwealth forces in Greece and Crete and North Africa, there was a series of British defeats. And a lack of air power, including the ability to gain and maintain air superiority, was highly important in those particular cases. And I will touch on that a little later in the lecture itself. The bomber offensive against Nazi Germany gained some ground in terms of the increasing number of resources applied to it. The early estimates of its effectiveness were based more on wishful thinking and assumptions as opposed to direct measurement. And it was not until the autumn of 1941 when the Butt report came out that looked at just how accurate the average bomber had achieved its delivery of its payload, and found that they were generally at least 5 miles and sometimes 10 miles away from the designated target. It was clear that the night bombing results were highly ineffective. And there were actually some proponents who started suggesting that there should be a return to daylight bombing in order to improve the accuracy. Though clearly there would have been an issue with the vulnerability of the bombers to daytime fighter defences. Right. Specifically, the 1941 plan for Fighter Command. Fighter sweeps over northern France and the Low Countries, but I think it was mainly northern France. And this was turned leaning into France, very much a question of trying to gain and maintain the initiative or the moral high ground through offensive action as proposed by Trenchard, the founder of the Royal Air Force. And the aim was to force the Luftwaffe to counter the sweeps and thereby inflict losses on the German fighter force, essentially a battle of attrition, which Fighter Command and particularly 11 Group were very, very confident that they would succeed in. Quick aside in terms of definitions, sweeps. This may vary from one source to another. This is the Imperial War Museum's definition. There were what were termed circuses, where you'd have several fighter squadrons escorting a small force of bombers, the bombers there being essentially a means or an intention to force the Germans to respond, so to avoid being bombed, rather obviously. Rodeos, which were large-scale fighter sweeps flown in good weather, with no bombers to escort, they were just fighters alone. And then rhubarbs, small numbers of fighters, generally just 2, and often flown in bad weather, with losses that actually arose through the weather itself, as well as being shot down by anti-aircraft artillery. And certainly, whatever damage those rhubarbs achieved, the losses far outweighed any value they gained. No plan survives contact. Because there was nothing really there in northern France and the Low Countries that was of vital value to the German war effort, the Luftwaffe could choose when and where to engage the fighter sweeps and the escorted bombers. And of course, they would always choose to do so when it was to their advantage, when they had the ability to attack from altitude, from out of the sun and so forth. And where there was no particular threat offered by those fighter sweeps, they would largely ignore them. And they had actually attempted a very similar tactic during 1940, and Fighter Command had ignored it in exactly the same way. And yet, curiously enough, expected the Germans somehow to react differently in exactly the same circumstance. And of course, there are far more vital targets in wartime economic senses in southeast England, so far as Britain was concerned. For example, the Supermarine Factory, the Woolwich Arsenal. Whereas northern France and the Low Countries, the Germans were not exactly vitally dependent on those particular areas or facilities. And it's interesting to see how the RAF was actually dispersing its strength or allocating its resources during this period. Start of spring of 1941. In the Middle East, Greece, East Africa, where Britain and its Commonwealth were fighting on 3 fronts, there were 33 squadrons. 16 bomber, 10 fighter, 2 naval, maritime reconnaissance, and 5 army cooperation. Back in the UK, 169, 45 bomber squadrons as the Bomber Command built up for its night offensive, 81 fighter squadrons, 81, and yet there were only 2 fighter gruppen in northern France, 30 coastal command squadrons, very important, and 13 army cooperation squadrons. If you look, I've put the word fighter in italic there because depending on which source you look at, the numbers do differ, sometimes quite considerably. But there's very little in the way of German air power poised in any way to create a particular or pose a particular threat to Britain during that period, and yet the number of fighter squadrons retained in this country was considerable, when indeed they were desperately needed elsewhere. Right, the leading players so far as the aircraft are concerned. The general description or account of 1941 and Fighter Command flying its sweeps over northern France is that the Supermarine Spitfire Mark V, the latest Mark that entered service at that time, was predominant. It faced the latest version of the Messerschmitt 109, the F. Note the highly splayed undercarriage, responsible for probably more losses on landing than were actually inflicted by the enemy. And the newly arrived Focke-Wulf 190, which appeared around, I think, April, May in the German squadrons in northern France. The nickname for the 190 in German was Würger, which is the German word for the bird, the Shrike. And the Shrike is also known as the butcher bird. And this is a very apt nickname for this highly, highly effective aircraft. An excellent design, a very, very capable fighter indeed. And the conventional account runs this way. Fighter Command was leaning into France, flying its circuses and so forth. And the Spitfire Mark V was having a bit of a tough time against the 109F, and particularly the 190A series. And then along came the Spitfire Mark IX, and balance was restored. Order was restored to the whole affair, and indeed, eventually, even ascendancy gained by the Mark IX. And if you've seen the film, Spitfire Icon of a Nation, I dare say quite a few of you here may have seen it. I think it came out in about 2017. I will say it was beautifully photographed, but I won't make any other comment on it. One of the people speaking in that said, almost overnight, Rolls-Royce fitted the new Merlin, and et cetera, et cetera. It was not quite so simple or as neat as that. But somehow that particular vision of events has gone pretty much into the public domain. I'm coming up to some more numbers now, as well as the figures on number of squadrons extant at any particular one time or within the order of battle of the Air Force. You get variation between sources of numbers concerning the aircraft lost and the aircraft claimed, and I haven't been able to resolve this. I've looked at multiple sources and I've not been able to pin down the definitive numbers. If anyone can tell me where I can find the definitive numbers of RAF aircraft lost in 1941 and the actual losses by the Germans, by the Luftwaffe aircraft shot down, I would be very, very interested to hear. And the curious thing is that the numbers actually differ not only between different sources, but even different sources by the same author. Norman Franks has written several books on Fighter Command, and in this particular book, Fighter Command Losses of the Second World War, you can see the monthly losses running across 1941, and they are quite considerable. In his book, Fighter Command's Air War, there are a similar set of numbers, but uniformly lower. And as far as I can make out, the lower set of numbers represents the aircraft actually lost in combat, the ones that were shot down during the missions themselves. I think the higher figure refers to the combat losses plus the other losses, such as write-offs through accident or just battle damage where an aircraft was considered to be beyond economical repair. So I have used the combat loss figures, the lower of those two sets, for working out the exchange ratio figures I'll give you in due course. Now, Fighter Command claims are notable, and generally notable in being much, much higher than the losses actually incurred. Just add the figures there. Very, very high numbers indeed. was a quiet start for the year until we got to June, and then the invasion of the Soviet Union, Barbarossa, spurred Britain into making a greater effort, trying to put pressure on Germany, force them to withdraw aircraft from the Eastern Front. And the claims were particularly high, as you can see, June and July, and remained pretty high, certainly compared to the first half of the year, for pretty much through to the end of the autumn. But how accurate were the claims themselves? In terms of what was likely to be achieved, it was frankly naive that the fighter sweeps en masse over France would draw the Luftwaffe into battle in any great numbers for a major attritional conflict. As I said, Fighter Command ignored the same German tactic in 1940, and eventually we had to try to provoke a reaction by using light bombers and eventually heavy bombers to draw the Luftwaffe into action. And even then, that was not wholly successful. Typically, they began by sending over small numbers of Bristol Blenheims, and not a particularly fast aircraft, and one that did not exactly carry a paralysing bomb load. This would hardly be a terrifying prospect for the Luftwaffe or the German war machine. They even went as far as to start flying some heavy bombers on some short-range missions within the radius of action of the escorting fighters, which was not particularly extensive. A much heavier bomb load, but again, there was really a shortage of really significant targets within that area. So once again, the Luftwaffe could largely pick and choose when they chose to engage. Better aircraft might have been something like the Douglas Boston from the States, faster, a really small bomb load, but we were not particularly quick at actually getting our Lend-Lease American aircraft into action. Now, as 1941 progressed, there was some people who took encouragement from the very high victory claims that Fighter Command pilots were making, and these are the claims that were actually regarded as being confirmed by the intelligence process, not just the probables, but the claims that were actually believed to have been genuine in the sense of having involved the shooting down and destruction of a German aircraft. And yet it was known from First World War experience that claims are extremely difficult to verify. Evidence was often lacking, even with camera gun film, and generally, with the best one in the world, the pilots would believe they had achieved a kill when in fact they had not. This was not a willful deception on their part, far from it. It was people in the heat of the moment believing they had achieved a kill, which was not necessarily the case. And I should emphasize, any criticism I make of the campaign in no way implies, nor should any be inferred, any criticism of the pilots themselves, whose courage and determination in this campaign was exemplary. My criticism is reserved for those much, much more senior. And in terms of the claims, as I say, the figures vary. They really vary quite a lot. End of December to the middle of June 1941, from Basil Collier, A History of Air Power. Daylight offensive operations, Fighter Command lost 51 pilots and claimed 44 German fighters shot down. Now, the Luftwaffe records show that they lost 40 fighters over France or the Low Countries during the same period. Now, you always know when you have lost an aircraft. It doesn't come back, or it comes back in such a state you've got to write it off. They attributed only 18 losses to RAF action in that period, so the exchange ratio was 2.8 to 1 in favour of the Luftwaffe. The absolute figures are not that huge, not by the standards of the day, but certainly the exchange ratio is not one you would wish to be involved with, and it certainly represents failure in terms of actually imposing loss or damage or degradation on the Luftwaffe's strength. And as early as the end of March, British intelligence was getting clear signs of a likely invasion of Russia and considerable units moving east, with the reduction in the Luftwaffe units in the west itself, such that when Luftwaffe 2 had left, plus elements from Luftwaffe 3 also sent east, there were only 260 bombers, 300 fighters, and 60 recce aircraft to cover the whole of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. So the numbers in northern France alone were really quite small indeed, much, much smaller than Fighter Command could muster. A few more figures. This is from a fairly recent book, Greg Bourne's RAF on the Offensive, which I can highly recommend. Fighter Command were flying 600 to 850 sorties a month. They lost 55 fighters in that period, and they claimed 40. Now, Lee Mallory, AOC of 11 Group, was keen really to suggest that Fighter Command, and particularly 11 Group, were having more success than appeared to be the case. And he proposed that if you added some of the probables claimed, or the probables awarded, to the confirmed total, then that meant the Luftwaffe was losing more aircraft than Fighter Command. Now, this was really a cross between wishful thinking and spinning the evidence. It was a confirmation bias, searching for some evidence that would actually meet his preference. Now, it's been said that the data will confess to anything providing you torture it sufficiently. In his case, he was certainly ready to start massaging the figures, to say the least. And I've said there, few believe the confirmed total, let alone the probables. Some people believed them, but there was certainly not unanimous agreement that the confirmed total alone was correct. Middle of June to the end of July, when it was really getting quite intensive, Fighter Command flew 8,000 sorties, covering some 370-odd bomber sorties, lost 123 pilots and claimed 322 enemy aircraft shot down. And at that time, the Luftwaffe day fighter force in northern France was only 200, so it was shot down essentially 1.5 times over. They could not have replaced them at that rate. In fact, they only lost 81 fighters, 1/4 of the total claimed, and overclaiming by factors of 2, 3, 4 times is not actually uncommon in wartime. Certainly not unique to the RAF or 11 Group by any means. It, I think, has affected pretty much every air force. But it does show the difficulty in which you're trying to, on the one hand, work out how successful the campaign was, while also being absolutely impartial and objective on the basis of incomplete evidence, some of which was undoubtedly incorrect. So I'm not in any way dismissing the challenges that the seniors faced when they were monitoring the progress of the campaign and trying to assess how best to adapt to the circumstances. Now, anyway, essentially, Fighter Command claimed an exchange ratio in their favour of over 2.6 to 1, when the actual ratio was 1.5 to 1 in reverse. And even then, you wonder, were all those 81 fighters that the that the Luftwaffe lost, were they combat losses, or is that a figure that is specifically covering the total losses, including the write-offs through accidents and battle damage? Unfortunately, not all of these sources are always quite so specific or exact in that respect. Middle of June through to early September, Fighter Command lost 194 pilots killed or prisoners of war, and another source mentions some 209 fighters being lost. I can't quite explain the difference. It's not a major difference, but an interesting one nevertheless. Lee Mallory claimed 11 Group had shot down some 437 aircraft, plus 182 probably damaged. Actual Luftwaffe records, 128 aircraft destroyed, 76 damaged, and many of the pilots safe. Of course, a German pilot bailing out over France could return to his unit. An RAF pilot would almost certainly be captured. A few might have evaded capture and got back after a very long period of going through France, through Spain, and then to Gibraltar, and then back to Britain. But generally, if you were shot down over France, you were lost. You were either killed or you were a prisoner of war. So it was a very costly campaign in terms of the pilots for the RAF, but far less so for the Luftwaffe. Again, these exchange ratios definitely not in favour of the Royal Air Force. They were essentially fighting a game in the circumstances that suited the defender. Almost rerunning the Battle of Britain in some respects. Then running through for the second half of the year, this figure of 731 German aircraft destroyed recurs in several accounts, but rarely, in fact, I've yet to see a reference to the primary sources for that. And post-war research suggested that Fighter Command only destroyed 114 German fighter aircraft over France, the Low Countries, and the UK, and yet lost 426 pilots in doing so, and some 504 fighters, 411 Spitfires, and 93 Hurricanes. And of course, as I said, those loss figures are absolute. There's no doubt about those. The claimed ratio, 1.45 to 1 in the RF's favour, and the actual exchange ratio, almost 4.5 to 1 in favour of the Luftwaffe. I mean, this was not just failure, this was defeat. And has been, as was commented, Dennis Richard quoted in John Terrain's book, The Right of the Line, another book I highly recommend. It was for such results as these that a force of 75 day fighter squadrons were retained in this country throughout the latter part of 1941. Whether this was a wise allocation of resources at a time when there were only 34 fighter squadrons to sustain our cause in the whole of the Middle and Far East is perhaps an open question. Now, I think that's an overly diplomatic way of expressing doubt about the matter. It was clearly a very, very dubious policy indeed. November 1941, some members of the air staff were directing, or at least advising, a curtailing of RAF offensive operations over Europe, as in day fighter sweeps. Some of the RAF seniors considered that it was just too costly given the results being achieved. And as action was moving eastwards, maybe some of these Spitfire units could be moved to the Middle East and so forth, where they were desperately needed, certainly for the air defence of Malta and to try to gain air superiority for the British and Commonwealth forces in the Western Desert in North Africa. Unfortunately, politics stepped in at this point and overrode strategy, and it was deemed that the operations of this nature were to continue into 1942. Things did not get any better in 1942. Again, exchange ratio better than 4 to 1 in favour of the Luftwaffe. Think how those aircraft could have been, and those pilots could have been used in the defence of Malta and in the Western Desert, far, far more productively, and where there was a desperate need for them. And it's interesting to look at the German perspective. The Luftwaffe War Diaries, the German Air Force in World War II, by Becker, 1964. The chapters of that book cover the expected areas, the Blitzkrieg, the attack on France, the Battle of Britain, the Med, Russia, the Atlantic, and then the defence of Germany against the combined strategic offensive by Bomber Command and the USAF 8th Air Force. It does not mention Fighter Command flying over northern France in 1941. I could find no reference to that at all. It was as though it was either never occurred to him to mention it, or, having considered it, he thought it was of insufficient importance to actually add to the book when he had all those other subjects to cover. There may well be some German sources that do expand on the 1941 campaign by Fighter Command, but I haven't found them so far. The demand for aircraft elsewhere, not least from the Soviets, in order to try and resist the German onslaught. And the Air Ministry found themselves in the interesting position that, as I say, underused Spitfire squadrons in the UK were losing fewer aircraft than were being built. This was despite the fact they were losing a very large number of Spitfires indeed. But they were actually still losing fewer than they were being built, while the hard-pressed Hurricane squadrons abroad were losing aircraft faster than they could be built. Not only was the Hurricane essentially obsolete, or at best obsolescent, production could not keep up with the rate at which they were being shot down by the Axis. Going back to that conventional account, leaning into France, Spitfire facing stiff opposition, particularly against the Focke-Wulf 190, and then the Spitfire Mark 9 essentially restoring good order and decency to the whole affair. Almost overnight. Reality was that the RAF was very much behind the drag curve for well over a year in terms of fighter performance compared to the Luftwaffe. The 109F came out in January 1941, the Focke-Wulf 190 in May of that year. The Spitfire Spitfire Mark 9 did not appear until July 1942, and it certainly didn't predominate in Fighter Command until well into 1943, with the Mark 5 continuing for months thereafter. The Mark 5 was actually the most produced Spitfire Mark. Fighter Command suffered those heavy losses. It was making those excessive claims. There was the poor exchange ratio, and there were no significant results. And the poor exchange ratio was hardly surprising, given that, on the one hand, they were fighting at a disadvantage at distance against an enemy that could choose the time and place of engagement, but where the enemy had superior aircraft available to them. So I certainly pity the pilots in 11 Group who faced an almost impossible task. You look in the middle of the year, June 1941, 80% of the Luftwaffe single-engine fighter force was the 109F. At that time, only 10% of Fighter Command had the Spitfire Mark V, the best Spitfire available at the time. Most of the force was still the Spitfire Mark II, and the Hurricane Mark I, which was obsolete, and the Hurricane Mark II, which was barely adequate. In Malta and the Western Desert, the Hurricane Mark I predominated. It was definitely obsolete. The aircraft sent there were often second-hand rather than factory fresh, and they were completely outmatched by the opposition, to the point where the continuing safety of Malta was in question given the aerial bombardment it was suffering from the Italians and the Germans. When we look at the order of battle of Fighter Command in April 1941, the Hurricane Mark I still there in substantial numbers, the Hurricane II taking over to an extent, still a few Spitfire Mark Is, quite a few Spitfire Mark IIs, and a single squadron of Spitfire Mark Vs. It was hardly predominant as the 1940 campaign proceeded. And a little later, in July, the number of Mark V squadrons had increased substantially, but they were still hardly predominant in the order of battle of Fighter Command or 11 Group. And looking at the aircraft themselves in a little more detail. During the Battle of Britain, the Messerschmitt 109E had been their main fighter, almost exclusively, and was very, very similar in performance and capability to the Spitfire Mark I and the Spitfire Mark II, which came out during the battle but did not become particularly numerous in Fighter Command's order of battle until late 1940, early 1941. Quite similar in performance, those two types. The Hurricane, in its Mark II form, it was considerably faster than the Mark I, but it was still barely fast enough. It was really only essentially now adequate, but certainly not in the leading edge of fighter capability or performance by that time. It was being used because there was no alternative. The RAF had expressed interest in heavily armed cannon fighters, and such options as the Bristol Beaufighter were produced, or proposed and then produced, developed from the Bristol Beaufort torpedo bomber. But as it appeared, it was far too large, far too heavy to be a fighter in the true sense, and it found its forte in things like anti-shipping strike, as this version here is shown. The Western Whirlwind, another twin-engined cannon-armed fighter, a heavy cannon armament in the nose for 20mm Hispano cannons. Potentially a successful fighter, but one that was underdeveloped and had a poor altitude performance and never really achieved its apparent potential and served only in 2 squadrons. And so the burden fell very much back on the Spitfire and the Hurricane, even though it was expected that aircraft like the Whirlwind would replace them or at least complement them to a considerable degree. The Spitfire Mark V came out in early 1941. It was faster than the Mark II, usefully faster than the Mark II, but it was handicapped. The Rolls-Royce Merlin it only had a single-speed supercharger, so it was not particularly effective at high altitude. Later, twin-speed, twin-stage superchargers transformed the performance of the Spitfire. The Mark V Spitfire did not have either of those benefits. And it was outclassed, say, by the 109F, which was notably quicker and certainly had a better altitude performance, high altitude performance, and the 190A series, which was, again, notably faster and outclassed the Mark V at low and medium altitudes. The 190 was not particularly good at altitude, but the 109F could deal with that, and so those two complemented each other very well, and the Spitfire Mark V could not really cope directly or evenly or equally with either one of them. So, as I say, the 190A series was 20 to 35 miles an hour faster at low and medium altitude than the Spitfire Mark V. It had a superior rate of climb, it was faster in the dive, and had a much, much greater rate of roll. And this was acknowledged by none other than Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Sholto Douglas, who summed up the 190 as the best all-round fighter in the world today. He was speaking in July 1942, just as the Spitfire Mark IX was appearing. And there was no doubt in my mind, nor in the minds of my pilots, of the Focke-Wulf 190's superiority. So he was absolutely candid in that conclusion that he presented to the Air Ministry. He was well aware of the deficiency in Fighter Command at the time. The rate of roll is worth illustrating. If you look here, Spitfire Mark V, the rate of roll increases as you get up to about 200 miles an hour. The x-axis is the speed, and the y-axis is the rate of roll in degrees per second. Thereafter, the rate of roll reduces as aerodynamic forces increase with increasing speed. The 190, on the other hand, its maximum rate of roll was reached far at a higher speed than the Spitfire Mark V and was considerably greater. It's about half as fast again. And although it diminishes, it retains that superiority all the way through. And that very high rate of roll was extremely effective in combat. Much is said about the ability of the Spitfire to turn very tightly, and it could. As this example will show, that a Spitfire Mark IX could turn happily within a P-51 Mustang. And certainly a Spitfire could turn within Messerschmitt 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190, but that wasn't enough. We look back to that rate of roll. The 190 could change its orientation much faster than the Spitfire, and that was a hugely beneficial element of maneuverability. In this case, for example, we have a 190 versus a Spitfire Mark IX, and the Spitfire can turn inside the 190, but the 190 responds, and this was a common tactic by the 190 pilots. They would do a 180-degree roll, reverse the turn from port to starboard, or starboard to port, depending on the circumstances, and the Spitfire could simply not follow in time to stay on their tail. It was a highly, highly effective aircraft, the 190. There was an option, though. You cut the wingtips off a Spitfire. Now, some people regard this as sacrilege. They love that beautiful elliptical planform. It did have a benefit, though, that if you look at a clipped wing Spitfire, it doesn't quite equal a 190, but it gets really close. So if you ever see a clipped wing Spitfire, do bear in mind that it was done for a very, very good reason. You might have that aesthetic loss, but you do get an agility gain. Other aircraft that the RAF had hoped to get into service. The Hawker Typhoon was seen as the replacement of the Hurricane, which indeed it was, its successor in time, and also, by some, as essentially taking over from the Spitfire as well. It was reasonably quick, but it was not particularly agile. It did not have a good high-altitude performance, and it was also very late. Even when it went into service, it suffered huge problems with the engine particularly and the airframe. It was on the brink of being cancelled, and this is one of the reasons that the Hurricane remained in service really well past its sell-by date. Its stablemate, the Tornado, also had major engine problems with the Rolls-Royce Vulture, to the extent that the engine was cancelled and the aircraft was cancelled as well. So major problems in terms of fighter procurement. Now, there was a Mark III Spitfire that was proposed, and that was going to use the Rolls-Royce Merlin 20 series. And that had a two-speed supercharger, which meant it could be effective at low altitude and at high altitude. And it was also very quick, much quicker than the Mark V. Unfortunately, it never got into production because the demand for the Rolls-Royce Merlin 20 series engine was so great that it could not be spared for this particularly promising aircraft. Instead, it went to keep the Hurricane simmering away with a degree of adequacy, but certainly not an outstanding performer. With the same engine, the Spitfire could reach 400 and the Hurricane only 340. There's really no comparison. But at the time, it was regarded as a necessity to give the Hurricane some form of capability, and the better Spitfire sadly could not be accommodated. Even with the Merlin 20 series, the Hurricane Mark II, it's still slower than a Spitfire Mark I. It didn't climb as fast as a Spitfire Mark II, and it's still definitely inferior even to the Messerschmitt 109E, let alone the 109F. Pass on quickly from that. There was also the issue of how far the fighters could reach into France during their sweeps. What has been called the tyranny of range. I think that was a phrase that Arthur Tedder used when he was talking about the use of air power in the Western Desert. In early 1941, the AOC of Bomber Command was actually keen on some occasional daylight operations, given the fact that the Luftwaffe was moving its strength eastwards. And Churchill was very, very supportive of this. The air staff were less so, because of the terrible losses suffered by RAF bombers in daylight raids in 1939. And Portal also doubted the potential and feasibility of long-range escort fighters. Churchill essentially told him this has got to be done, and said if you can't extend fighter range, you will be helpless in the west and beaten in the east. Unfortunately, nothing very significant was actually done for quite a while. And just how far could a Spitfire go? Its radius of action. That inner circle, highlighted in yellow, was in effect the radius of action of a standard Spitfire with internal fuel only, just about gets into northern France and northern Belgium, or western Belgium. There was a so-called long-range version of the Spitfire that had a range extension capability, extended its radius, but it only went out to about Rouen and into Belgium to an extent. Couldn't even reach Paris. Possibly a little clearer on this map as opposed to the original. Still short of Paris. Now, eventually, an escort version of the Spitfire was developed by, of all people, the Americans, and it would have been capable of getting out there. The interest was not taken up, unfortunately, by the Air Ministry, and so that never really came to fruition. Range extension is reasonably straightforward. You can fit drop tanks, as seen here on these 109s, or underwing drop tanks rather than centerline drop tanks, as was done fairly routinely on the Hurricane when it was doing a night intruder role, which was actually quite effective. And the notion of extending the Spitfire range was actually raised fairly early on, March 1940, by Sholto Douglas when he was the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff. And he ordered 100 medium-range Spitfires that would be fitted with the rear fuselage 29-gallon tank that was fitted in the photo RAeS Spitfires. And Supermarine didn't like this idea because it meant repositioning equipment in the rear fuselage to make space for the tank, which seems a little bit defeatist, but it was accepted. And Supermarine suggested instead you could have a slipper tank of some kind, jettisonable, fitted under wing. Instead, they ended up with a fixed tank fitted to the port wing. As seen here, that monstrosity, that lump just rigidly attached to the port wing, could not be jettisoned and had a very significant effect on the performance. Unsurprisingly, it was extremely unpopular with the crews. For some reason, little was done to find an alternative, such as fitting the drop tanks as fitted on the Hurricane. This was used for a short time and then discarded, quite rightly. And it would have reached the second of those two yellow rings. So it really made no significant difference and yet put the aircraft at a considerable disadvantage. Eventually they came up with what was termed a slipper tank for the Spitfire, which was a fitment on the centerline. It looked a bit like a shallow bath. And you can see one just about there on this Mark 12, but close up in a drawing, essentially that shallow bathtub fitted just behind the carburettor intake. Not too draggy, and they could be jettisoned as well. So it was a rather more elegant solution, not the ideal. But that took some time to come about. Something like that during the 1941 fighter suites would have been invaluable in terms of extending radius of action or endurance over enemy territory. Later, things like torpedo-shaped drop tanks were fitted. And as I said, the Americans also modified a Spitfire to give it a range that would have taken it almost out to Berlin, with increased internal fuel and underwing drop tanks as used on the Mustang, also seen here. But there was not exactly an enthusiastic reception for this initiative from the Air Ministry itself, despite the fact it would have taken a Spitfire about that far. There was also a curious slow take-up of American aircraft supplied to the RAF. The Fleet Air Arm were rather more quick off the mark. For example, they started using the Grumman Wildcat as early as December 1940, mainly through necessity, because they had nothing beginning to approach the Wildcat's performance for a carrier-borne aircraft. But America supplied quite capable aircraft, such as the Curtiss P-36 Mohawk. It had no European use, although it was used in East Africa, but not until some 16 months after receiving the first example from the USA. Not a particularly quick aircraft, but a highly manoeuvrable one, and one that could well have had a useful role in ground attack at some point in the European theatre. Its successor, the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk, reasonably quick, about as fast as a Spitfire Mark V, and it was actually a more capable aircraft than its reputation sometimes suggests. It was regarded as generally superior to the Hurricane, which really was on the way out. It had lighter, more responsive controls and could certainly outturn the Hurricane, which had a pretty good turning circle of its own. And April 1941, there were 100 Tomahawks in depots, and yet none of them operational. And even a year, or nearly a year after they arrived, not a single operational sword had been flown, and they weren't used until May of 41, and that was in the Mediterranean theatre, in Syria specifically. Capable aircraft that perhaps was a little underused to begin with. And then looking at the prospects for 1942, it was pretty gloomy. The Spitfire Mark V was outperformed by the 109F at high altitude, and definitely outperformed in every respect except turning circle by the Focke 190 at low and medium altitude. Even the Hurricane II, it was obsolete so far as air superiority was concerned. It was so much slower than the 109 that it really was not capable of standing its ground. Unsurprisingly, Sholto-Douglas wanted Hurricane Mark I production ended and the Hurricane Mark II replaced as soon as possible by the Typhoon, but its major development problems was very much limiting the numbers that could actually be put into service and also maintained in service given its poor reliability. And such that in April 1941 they were still expecting a substantial number of squadrons in Fighter Command still to be flying the Hurricane into 1942. And this was, as I said earlier, through necessity, because we could simply not provide anything more advanced, better developed to put into the order of battle. Now, in his post-war dispatch on air operations by Fighter Command in 1941, Sholto-Douglas said, Fighter Command became largely an instrument for containing enemy forces in northern France and attempting to compel the return of units from the Eastern Front. Now, he's clearly chosen his words very carefully here, attempting to compel the return of units from the Eastern Front, because essentially they did not achieve that. They may have attempted to do so, but failed. I'm not aware of any units returning from the Eastern Front, specifically into northern France. Eventually, such units had to be returned from the Russian campaign, partly down into the Mediterranean, and then as the daylight offensive by the 8th Air Force really got into its stride in late 1943 and then into 1944 for the defence of the Reich itself, the German homeland. Essentially, the plan failed. It did not survive contact with the enemy. It did not contain enemy forces in northern France by flying these fighter sweeps, and it did not compel any return of such units from the Eastern Front to reinforce those units in northern France. The reality was there was just nothing there that was so important to the Germans that they would be forced to engage. When the 8th Air Force started flying over Germany itself, then the Luftwaffe were forced to engage. They would either have their vital facilities, including their aircraft factories, destroyed on the ground, and then when they did engage, the 8th Air Force, particularly when it had its all-the-way fighter escort to Berlin and back, they were destroyed in the air. RAF number 2 group generally were the owners of the aircraft, the bombers that occasionally flew with the fighter sweeps, and the AOC, AVM Stevenson, he said, Lee Mallory was fantastically wrong that he could make any serious impression on the German war machine by trying to fight the Battle of Britain in reverse. And it's interesting that even in 1944, there was an internal Air Ministry report, or memorandum, that was really quite candid. May not have had a particularly wide circulation, but it was pretty candid in its assessment. It is true that we used our fighters over France, but once the Luftwaffe moved its bases further away, Fighter Command could not be used in a true offensive role, and a great many Spitfires and Hurricanes remained idle in Britain while there was urgent work to be done elsewhere. Which is pretty damning, but it's also correct. The means to achieve that air superiority at range were at hand. The Mustang, in its P-51A form, entered RAF service in April 1942. It was fast, it had a very long range, It didn't have a great high altitude performance, but then when it had the Merlin transplanted into it, it became that war-winning weapon, the long-range escort fighter for the 8th Air Force's daylight campaign. They became known as the Little Friends to the bomber crews, who welcomed their presence, as can be seen there with the high altitude contrails, with the fighters weaving so as not to overtake the bomber stream. And Hermann Göring himself, the man mentioned in the Battle of Britain official report, which did not mention Hugh Dowding, standing on the roof of the Air Ministry in Berlin, he looked up and he could see Mustangs overhead that had flown all the way from East Anglia, could defend the bombers over Berlin and then fly back. And that was his comment, the war is lost. And when he was being interrogated after the war, he said when he saw this, he said, I knew the game was up. So 1941, to summarise it, definitely an application of the Trenchardian offensive spirit, but it resulted in heavy losses and poor results. There was a dogmatic continuation with this failed policy of short-range fighter sweeps, and a contrasting and baffling reluctance to develop long-range fighter escort capability, which would have actually used those resources to far, far greater effect. And that's it. So if you have any questions.
Thank you very much for a stimulating survey of statistics, which...
That makes it sound so boring.
No, it wasn't at all. It was fascinating.
Statistics, indeed.
To look at it. Anyone got any questions?
Oh. Bill.
The microphone will come to you.
Bill Tyke. Thanks, Paul. That was magnificent.
Bill, it's good to see you again.
To what extent do you think that the RAF at that level probably saddled with the politicians feeling that they didn't want to shift the fighters out because how would they justify it if the Luftwaffe came? And I think at the time there was still a feeling, notwithstanding even the move into Barbarossa, that they would come back. Mm-hmm. How much do you think it was simply giving the boys something to do and giving them a bit of experience?
I think there was an element of that to try to gain and maintain the initiative and to inculcate a sense of aggression within the force such that it wouldn't simply see itself as purely defensive. In terms of the possibility of a return by the Luftwaffe to a mass daylight campaign over Britain, again with hindsight we know that they became enmeshed in the years-long Barbarossa campaign, but at the time it was believed by many that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, and then of course Germany could reapply its resources elsewhere, including back against Britain once more. But of course these things take time, they take months, and once the Luftwaffe had moved eastwards, there was that window of opportunity. The extent to which an aerial knockout blow, the so-called knockout blow, was truly feasible, I think that was an overstated fear on their part. But I agree, I think the opportunity they saw of using that Trenchardian offensive action as a means of essentially getting the aircrew in the right frame of mind was one element, one factor in their decision. But then why didn't they take it further and look for ranging into Germany, of getting back into a daylight campaign, escorting the bombers long range? Instead, Fighter Command ended up largely idle with massive resources in the UK doing very little. And if you read Johnny Johnson on the subject, for example, he is absolutely scathing about the decisions made and the lack of initiative and the lack of, what you might call, anything like energy to bring about a change in that area. This is something the Americans made happen with the Mustang particularly. Unfortunately, that same energy was not available. That same farsightedness was not available within the Air Ministry and the higher echelons of the RAF.
Thank you. Good evening. There's two things you can probably answer, but their questions are the effect of the Americans supplying a higher octane fuel to all our aircraft, and what that effect was on the aircraft and the war in general. And the famous, I think it was Beatrice's orifice about the carburetors in the Merlin flooding, and she provided this idea of like an O-ring inside the carburetor, yes, which stopped the flooding.
Yes.
What sort of dates were they? Those two elements.
1940.
Oh, that was so. It was, yeah. So did that give greater altitude once that, or it just stopped it It was something to do with diving. You didn't...
It was the effect of negative G, which caused the carburetor to flood and the engine to cut out momentarily. The orifice reduced the fuel, the mass flow rate of the fuel, which then reduced the tendency of the carburetor to flood. The higher octane fuel was extremely important in terms of permitting greater power output at any altitude.
What was the date of that?
100 octane fuel became available pre-Battle of Britain.
Okay. Yeah. But before then, it was what, 80 or 70?
87 octane, I think.
Oh, so that would have made quite a difference then.
It did.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Lucy Hruskova, so 2 questions. So the first one would be, you've declared at the beginning that the number of Gruppen in France was actually quite low. However, the number of downed UK or British aircraft seems to be quite high, obviously, in comparison also to the losses. Was that purely owed to the technical aircraft differences that you've just outlined? Or what do you think, what role did aircrew and training of pilots and pilots in general play in this?
There was a combination of factors. Essentially, it was a home game for the Luftwaffe, just as the Battle of Britain was a home game for the Royal Air Force. The German fighters at the time were definitely superior to the RAF fighters. There was only equality gained at the end of 1942, 1943. And the experience level in quite a lot of fighter command was not particularly high, as there had been heavy losses during the Battle of Britain, and so the majority of the aircrew were relatively new. It was, to what extent the proportion of German aircrew in northern France was new or experienced, I'm not sure. They probably had tried to get a reasonable balance between the two. But it was that combination, the fact that the RAF was playing away, the aircraft were inferior, and quite a lot of the pilots were inexperienced. All of those combined to result in very heavy losses. As I mentioned, any pilot who bails out was almost certainly captured, as opposed to returning to his unit. And with that combination of factors, they were on a losing game from the beginning.
Thank you very much. And the second question would be on the longer range design of the aircraft involved. Given what sort of difference the Mustang made, has never really thought about it in Superman, or were they just so overwhelmed by the production that they had to make the kind of replacement of the losses? It seemed like just putting another couple of drop tanks on the aircraft would have made such a difference in so many ways, but it didn't seem, there were so many ways how it didn't seem to happen.
Do you mean on the Mustang or on the Spitfire?
No, in the Spitfire, because it seems that the Mustang arrived and the main advantage of it was a longer range, and that if that would have happened on the Spitfire a lot earlier, it could have solved so many issues. It
could have done. The American development, they only actually modified 2 Spitfires in the States to increase the range, but they showed conclusively it could be done. It was simply a question of increasing the internal fuel. You put a big tank in the back, in the rear fuselage. It affects the lateral stability, and this was the case with the Mustang, and it just made it difficult to fly until you burned the fuel off in the rear tank, and then stability was restored. And the drop tanks you'd then use the drop tank fuel, throw away the drop tanks, and you were back to a clean airframe with the original internal fuel. It was a very effective design. The Mustang also benefited through having lower drag than the Spitfire.
That they didn't want to implement something like this on the Spitfire earlier?
I think it was a question where RAF doctrine became dogmatic, that they had the view that long-range escort by a single-engined aircraft was not possible, and therefore, rather than trying it out, they made no attempt to see if it could be done, or at least no significant attempt for several years. The Americans simply realized that if they were to make their daylight campaign acceptable in terms of the losses they faced, they had to have long-range escort, so they developed long-range escort. It just became a necessity for them. Unfortunately, people like Portal just could not conceive of this being possible. And even after the American modified Spitfires were flown back to Britain, actually across the Atlantic, I think they went Newfoundland, Greenland, Iceland, Scotland, and then down to Boscombe Down, they were assessed and reported on very negatively. It was a question of not invented here. Which is unfortunate, but it is part of human nature.
Any further questions?
Do you discount the contribution made by the Mark VIII Spitfire, you know, the converted Mark Vs or the new builds?
Well, the Mark VIII
bridging the
didn't come
gap
out till
before the Mark
1943.
IX? Oh, it was later than that. I
Yeah.
didn't know if it was...
This is one of the confusing things about the Spitfire history, in that the Mark VIII came out after the Mark IX, just to make things really confusing.
To stop the gap between the production shortfalls
Exactly,
on the Mark IX. Yeah, but it was too little too late.
The Mark VIII came out in, I think, June 1943.
Thank you.
It makes me sound like such a spotter, doesn't it?
Dave Dixon from Farnborough, where incidentally there's a pub called the Tilly Shilling. My question is regarding the numbers you had for the US fighters that were delivered relatively early on. You mentioned 100, I think, for the, was it with the Tomahawk? Do you think maybe one of the reasons why they weren't taken into service was because in order to service those existing aircraft that were UK produced, they had a logistical chain where you could produce spare parts and so forth? And with the Battle of the Atlantic in particular being quite fierce in 41, reliance on a US supply chain for what is relatively a small number of aircraft might have been a factor in them not being taken into service earlier?
I'm sure that was one factor. On the other hand, as I mentioned, the Fleet Air Arm seemed to manage with the Grumman Wildcat, which also had a transatlantic supply chain, and the 100-octane fuel was also transatlantic. It was, I think, always refined in the States and shipped here, as opposed to being refined here. So there were transatlantic elements in quite a few areas of the British war machine. But it would have been a factor that a new aircraft type can't be put into service as though you just picked up a rental car from Enterprise. Obviously, you've got to build the infrastructure, the training and so forth, such that it actually has a reasonable maintenance base, plus, of course, the training of the pilots. So, yes, it's not a point... perhaps I overemphasise the delay in terms of criticism of the powers that be. It's certainly not simple.
Thanks.
One more question back in the front, please.
Yes, I saw a film once where...
So, microphone coming.
I saw a film once where Sir Douglas Bader was saying he was flying his Spitfire Mark V, and he saw these German aircraft, he claimed they were German aircraft, which had radial engines coming up to them and appearing to be rather quick and rather useful. When he reported this back to the sort of normal power structure, high command in the UK, they were talking about it. I think the Americans loaned the French some Harvard aircraft. They were probably Harvards. Is that a true story?
I think the original intelligence assessment was they might be the Curtiss Mohawk.
Oh, I see.
The French had some of those, and the 190 came as a huge surprise. And there was also this essential doctrinal view that a radial engine fighter would not be effective. So there was...
is that because of a drag issue, or...?
Well, it depends on how well designed it is. Clearly, the performance of the 190 showed that it wasn't an issue.
No, exactly. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Can we just make that the last question?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for the plug for the book. I'll slip you the tenner later, okay? You mentioned 87 squadrons were in Fighter Command. How many of those would you have put somewhere else? And at what stage would you have put the Spitfire somewhere else, if you were in charge of Fighter Command?
Certainly, I think Malta deserved better defence much, much sooner, as it was having a particularly hard time, because a second-hand Hurricane Mark I was hardly equal to the best of the Italian Air Force. Exactly when I'd have done that, I couldn't name you a date. I'd have to do a little more research.
Would you put them in France?
Oh, you mean 1940? Oh, I thought you meant 1941.
Oh, well, I mean, how far back do you want to go? I mean, could we have Spitfires in Norway in 1940 instead of Gladiators? Did we have to keep them at home?
Well, that was certainly possible. It wasn't done at the time, and I dare say they were retained in terms of maintaining the British air defences. But 1941, I think the more advanced fighters, the Spitfire Mark V, certainly the Spitfire Mark II, could have been moved to Malta and the Western Desert without undue peril for the nation. 1940, I'm not so sure. That's not a period I've studied in much detail.
Thank you, everybody. And I could ask Peter to give us the benefit of his vote of thanks.
You were making notes during this, Peter. I always find that slightly off-putting.
So, Paul introduced his lecture by pointing out really how the literature has not really served Fighter Command in 1941 very well indeed. And I think you described it as Fighter Command's second act. How do you follow the Battle of Britain? I'm reminded of, occasionally the melody maker would say that it was that difficult second album where you've got all your hits on the first album and the next one is a bit of a disappointment. I've always had a bit of confusion with regard to difference between circuses and rodeos and rhubarbs, and I think, Paul, you made it a bit clear that it's not clear on that front. Certainly it was a difficult thing for Fighter Command. They'd built up a large force, and the enemy didn't always want to come up and face them, which I think somebody in the questions said something about a force looking for something to do, almost a job creation scheme. And they had a technology imbalance with the aircraft they had to use. Plus, again, I think the word inertia came up in the questions, and it does seem as though Fighter Command was not thinking very much outside of the box. But I've found it a very interesting and educational lecture, so I'm very grateful to you, Paul, and I would ask the members of the audience to join me in thanking you in the usual way.
Oh,